Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 360. It's October the 27th, 1978, and this is side one. I started to prepare the tape for you on the new Pope, the Polish Pope, and there was so much material that I decided it would take maybe 2 or 3 weeks, probably 2 weeks, of just going into the last Pope or the several popes before him and the role of the Catholic Church in the conspiracies in the past, and a brief history of that, and then predictions of the future and my fears of this new Pope. There was so much material that I'm going to put that off until next week and start an analysis of that Pope from the material that I already have available. One item before I get started on the tape today is that I've been watching that airplane crash that took place just a month ago in San Diego, the PSA pilot that crashed with a small Cessna. The Cessna went into the wing of the plane, went over San Diego, because our Lieutenant Governor, Merv Dymally, was supposed to be on that plane and canceled it just as a fluke. His flight he took Sunday night instead of Monday morning, and his opponent is Mike Kerb with connections. His campaign is run by Ken Reitz of the Dirty Tricks, of the Richard Nixon Dirty Tricks Department. So if you've been taking the tapes regularly, you can get the background. I have that pretty well covered up to this date, and for those of you that just have this tape on, you'll have to order the back ones. I won't repeat that information. But to update it, there's an article this week in the San Jose Mercury on October the 26th about the pilot struggling to save the plane, and I thought it was interesting because it has his last remarks on the plane, and then it said that they weren't sure whose voice it was, that there were other crewmen in the airplane. There was a pilot by the name of Bob Fox and an engineer, Martin Wayne, and also in the cockpit was another PSA pilot, Mr. Nelson, but along with them was an Anthony Poley, a co-pilot for the Flying Tiger airline. Poley and Nelson were riding free in the jump seats of the cockpit at the time that these planes crashed, and I thought that was interesting because the Flying Tiger airline was owned partly by Madame Chenault. I don't know if she still owns it or not. It was a CIA airplane, recognized as a CIA plane, and this pilot had along with him a man for the Flying Tiger Airlines that was just sitting there for no special purpose. When the plane went down, this man was there and was identified as coming along for the ride. He was just flying free in the back of the cockpit. That's of interest to me, and I think some of you should know that in the San Francisco Chronicle of the same day, yesterday, it was not the 20th, the 26th, they had an article about the pilot and his last remarks on the plane, but didn't mention that anybody from the Flying Tiger Airlines was in the cockpit. That was completely left out of the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Jose Mercury had it. Well, I had mentioned last week on the tape, or the week before, that I would go in to some of the things that have happened to me and my family, and they may be of interest to you. I get calls all the time on radio shows, how come you're still alive, and a lot of people don't realize, and I don't realize myself, the hazards of doing research until you just put it in a column and add it up. I seem to be able to add up everybody else's problems, but I'm slow to add up the things that have happened to me, and I did compile a list of things that I was going to do one time and put it off because after the summer vacation I didn't think it would be of any interest to the listeners, particularly that we should get right into the James Earl Ray hearings before the House Select Committee, because the things that happened to me no one would believe anyway, such as being on Vancouver Island and having a rattlesnake in your tent, and when you're gone for the day, and a car parked in front of your property, on your property when you go out in the evening, and other people parked there that you can't see, their cars are there and you don't know where they are. And traveling is always a hazard for me, and I expect a certain amount of it. The snake story I'll go into a little more later, but I didn't think anybody would believe it anyway. I took the people that were with me, my daughter, niece, and a friend, and we slept at another friend's that night in the town where the campsite is, and they were laughing because there's no snakes on Vancouver Island, and this was a figment of imagination of the 3 people that were in the tent and heard it and ran out screaming, and then we told other people, and they said there is no such thing. And then I was quite shaken up when I was down in L.A. a couple of weeks ago to read about Synanon and the rattlesnake in the mailbox, because rattlesnakes are used as a weapon, and I knew this had been planted there. There's no other way it could have happened. It was so frightening to us that we just left the whole tent there, which will cost another $150 to get a new tent next summer. I just left it there and took the kids down to Victoria and decided I couldn't hassle with this because it's, again, one of those things that nobody would believe. And at that time, I began to think of the things that had happened to us and put it off. But the last 2 weeks have been really hard on me. I'm over the hump now. I'm like unsinkable Molly Brown, and I do rally. But I had a terrible time the last 2 weeks, and I feel that the pressure over me, with the exception of a man and woman who have built a house right next to me, and that's still a pressure point for me, and we may go into that. I was under tremendous pressure in the last couple of weeks. I mean, it was really bad. And again, it was part of my psychic ability to help me to forewarn or to move cautiously, which I did, but I feel strong again. And so we'll go on with certain things that have happened in the past and what I was doing that I think probably provoked it. I know that in May 1968, Rose Kennedy was down here in Monterey Peninsula campaigning for Robert Kennedy. And I put a poem in her hands because John Kennedy's birthday was the next day. I remember the date because both of our birthdays are May 29th. And I said, here's a poem in memory of John. And she accepted it. And in it was a letter telling her how Robert was going to be killed. He would be killed from behind. Somebody would be behind him, and they would kill him. And 5 days later, Robert Kennedy was dead. I never did hear from Rose Kennedy or the Secret Service or the FBI or anybody on how I would happen to know that Robert Kennedy would be dead within that time period or soon before he ever became a president of the United States. And then it was years later that I found out, after I met Ted Charach and saw the movie The Second Gun, that I was absolutely convinced that he was, in fact, shot from behind, and the fatal shot didn't come from the front. But one of the things that upset me the day I heard Rose talking, it was at the Mark Thomas Inn over near the airport, was that she was campaigning for Robert, and she sounded so calloused. She could say, we wanted Joe to be president, and then he died in an airplane crash. We wanted John to be president, and he was president 1,000 days, and then he was killed. And she sort of rattled off, and now I want you to let Bobby be president of the United States. And my first feeling was, what a hard-ass bitch. I mean, this woman's going out and telling you to put her third son up for president. And it just sounded so cold, the way she rattled it off. It was just hard to explain. It was so matter-of-fact, like, here's the next one we're giving our country, and line up. But it stayed with me. Her voice stayed with me in the way she did it. And then when I was thinking of the things I wanted to share with you that happened to our family, I didn't want you to have the same feeling. I can talk about my car being on fire, my son being given acid, or Bonnie being killed, and Barbara almost killed, and I can run down these things. And I don't want you to think like I felt about Rose Kennedy, and maybe I judged her wrong, because there's no way to evaluate the silent hours or the years of crying. There's just no way to tell you how I feel. Even when I talk about it, I tell you I feel it. But I'm just telling you in chronological order some of the things that have happened, because I think they should be of interest to you and any other researcher who is trying to find out some truth about this world, not only our country, but the world. An incident took place several weeks ago with Bob Trevor up at KGO. I was supposed to be on KGO Sunday night, September the 15th it was, and he had done a promotion for a long time. We do conference calls to the house, and he had told people for 3 weeks or so that I would be up on Sunday night at the station. The station is on Golden Gate in San Francisco. It's a lonely area. When you leave there at 12 o'clock at night, every time I've been there, a certain gentleman has jumped up towards me. He hasn't hurt me, and he's given me his card and identification. He's had something to tell me. But he jumps right out of the building when I come and follows me to the car. And I've had other instances of car chases in San Francisco that I will talk about. And I agreed to go there, even though it was 9 to 12. I wasn't too afraid. But the story of the rattlesnake broke, and that was a week before the Synanon story, and that really convinced me that my feelings about the man on the property whose license I had taken and the planting of the stake had happened to me, just as it happened to that lawyer who was fighting Synanon. And then the week before I was to go up to Bob Trevor in San Francisco, the wheels came off my tire. If any of you live nearby me or have gone up the hill here to my home. I'm a mile and a tenth straight up a steep hill, and I came down that hill and just happened to have a half hour to spare before meeting somebody. It was a fluke that I had the half hour because I'm usually pretty punctual, and I was off on my time. So I stopped at the gas station to fill up with gasoline so I don't have to waste that extra time. And I was half full, and when I turned out of the gasoline station and turned my tires, the wheels were hitting the fenders, and I knew that they weren't punched in, that I hadn't had an accident. So I made a circle around the gas station and left the car there, and they told me that the nuts in the lower control arm were missing, and they had been taken off. I don't know how it happened, but the wheels had dropped down and were hitting the fender, and if I'd gone down the hill, I would have had no control of the car. And they told me at the Union Station that he had never seen something like this. They suggested that I lock the car at night because you'd have to get into the hood there. And so the first time in my life, in all the years that I've had a car, except for being in the cities where you lock the car, I'm locking the car just as a precautionary thing, which I don't like to do. I don't like that kind of paranoia, or to think that something would happen where my neighbors could come up, or because otherwise you'd hear cars around here at night on the hill. You can hear them coming up the hill. But then the Friday before I was supposed to go to San Francisco, I got a phone call with a phony Mexican accent. Do you believe in Jesus? You better pray to the Lord because you're going to die. And when you die, you will be praying, and you're going to die soon. And the day that I got that, it was on Friday in September rather, and I had an appointment that day. It was the 12th with Reverend Dumke, and he was coming down with two people to work on some information about the CIA and the Patty Hearst case. And I didn't know whether the threat was coming from the future trial that's going to take place in the Bay Area, the Manson, Charles Winnan trial versus Paul Krasner and Rolling Stone magazine. That's a $60 million trial with Melvin Belli representing the prosecution. And I'm really the hinging primary witness in this particular trial that holds this defense together. The Rolling Stones have spent about $2 million in legal fees already. It's a big trial, and a lot of it hinges. I'm the main witness in this trial that got the story rolling in the first place. I'm not a defendant in the trial. I don't think a court of law would sensibly take on a lot of the things that I have alleged or charged, but they're taking on Rolling Stone. I didn't even write the article for them, but I made the introduction of Paul Krasner to the people who had information about supplying the drugs for the Manson family. Well, because this trial is coming up, and because of the work I'm doing on the House Select Committee or with the Patty Hearst Committee, or being public on so many things, I didn't know where the pressure was coming, but I did call Bob and asked if I could do it from the House, that I'd feel more secure. And he said I could, and I didn't go to San Francisco because I just didn't want to be on the road. Again, I got a call one night from the police department in Carmel impersonating the police department. It wasn't from them at all, saying my daughter was there, and this was 10 o'clock at night, that she'd been picked up on the beach and was smoking marijuana. And Barbara doesn't have drugs or marijuana, and she was over 21, so I don't know why I'd have to release her anyway, but I said I'd come down there. And then, again, a fluke, a telephone show, I think it was in St. Paul, somewhere in the east. I had a telephone conference call, and I called the police department to say that I'd be just a half hour late, that she shouldn't expect me for a half hour or an hour, and they said she wasn't even there, and we checked the university, and she was at her night classes. So again, I'd be coming down this dark hill on a lonely road, down Carmel Valley Road, and it was a fluke, so that I had the feeling that something like this could come on the way home from KGO, and I did that conference call, so that the wheels coming off the car and the rattlesnake story breaking, that the snake is used as a weapon, and then the death threat, I decided to play it safe and stay home. But I had made out a list in chronological order of things that have happened to me and my family, and I'll briefly run them down, and some of them will go into detail, and others will pass off pretty fast. When I went to New Orleans to see District Attorney Jim Garrison, he had arrested Clay Shaw, and David Ferry had then been killed promptly. I didn't want Jim to make reservations for me. He wanted to make them at a hotel in New Orleans. I said, I'll make my own because I figured somebody in his office would then know where I was staying, and I got a cab, went into the French Quarter of New Orleans, stayed at this very quaint hotel, put the bolt on the door, locked my door, went to sleep. The next morning took a cab to see District Attorney Jim Garrison and spent the day with him, was at his home in the evening, had dinner out, came home, and back to the hotel room, put my things down and looked, and the lock was taken off the door. I had my luggage kept in Dallas, Texas, 5 days from that trip. This was in 1967. They kept all my research and flew it back on a special plane. I had locks torn off my luggage when I went to Dayton, Ohio to speak. My plane tickets had been canceled. There was a bomb scare on one plane that came from Georgia to Dallas. I never knew until I got my Freedom of Information papers, a few of them, where the bomb scare came from. That was after I was visiting Jim Garrison. I've had a near collision of an airplane coming out of Sacramento. The wheels have come off a plane going to O'Hare Airport in Chicago on the way to Dayton, Ohio. My oldest son, Marvin, was given acid by Carolyn Gilman. Carolyn and Peter have worked with the intelligence community. This was in 1967 while I was in New Orleans. My other son, David, had dinner with an instructor who teaches. He's from Brazil at the DLI language school. We trusted him and knew him a long time. His name is Lee. And the night after David had dinner, 20 minutes later, he sort of conked out and was hazy and drove home, and on the way home had a car crash and was almost killed. He was all right. He was thrown out of the car, but it could have been a really serious incident. And he never called Lee again. Subconsciously, he must have associated the dinner or something with the accident, because the man had been a driver. He'd come up from Brazil and was going to UCLA and worked for my first husband, and the boys went to a private school, and he moved into the house and was driving the boys around. And then when we moved up here, he had come up here and was teaching language at the Defense Language School in the department. He's from Brazil. I've had my car on fire twice, both two different cars. One was a Mercury station wagon and one was a Saab. One went up in flames, and the other, the plate just burned black, and they told me to save it as a souvenir because it seemed the way the Saab was built, it didn't go up in flames, but the other one almost blew up. And again, a fluke. A man up at Grants Pass at the gas station put his arms around me and the person I was with and said, "You were really meant to live," because at that point it was raining and a rainbow came out, and somebody behind us had helped put out the fire, and we weren't blown up. I've seen my best friends, such as Louise James, her mind drugged, the same kind of acid trip that Marvin got, memory erased, dropped her political activity, and we'll do a little more about Louise, too, because I was close to her in the Carmel area. Up in Canada this summer, we parked by a lake coming home outside of Washington. We were in Washington State and got this huge 4-inch bolt that ripped a brand new tire. It's about a quarter of an inch wide, and I have it hanging from a rivet in my kitchen as a souvenir because, again, when we got to the gas station, they said they had never seen anything like this. It wasn't pointed. It wasn't like a nail. It was just a huge bolt, which they believed probably had to be placed backward or forward onto the tires, so that we had a tent trailer that you park, and then your car pulls forward because the sides of the tent trailer come down, and there's no space because the back of the car is there. And then in the morning, you back up to attach it. So whether you go forward or backward, there was somebody outside the tent at 6 in the morning, and my niece heard it, and she was yelling, and my daughter said, "Shut up," and she said, "No, there's noise," and she heard somebody opening and closing the food box, and she heard this noise, and it was cold and kind of dark. We went back to sleep till 7, and we weren't on the road 20 minutes when our tire was low, and we were aware of the fact that it wasn't completely flat, but the bolt was so big it didn't make it flat, but it was a new tire before we left, and it had to be wrenched out, and the tire was thrown away. It couldn't be patched in any way. So we have a souvenir. There was a man that pulled up next to us where we camped who had a sheriff. He was campaigning for somebody for sheriff of the area. I don't know whether it was himself or a friend, and they pulled up and joined us at night, had some hot chocolate, and talked by the campsite, and their son talked with my daughter and niece and friend, and they came over and visited, and I don't know whether it had anything to do with those people, but somebody was walking around outside about 6 in the morning, and then about 7:30 our tire was completely gone. And as I say, I've had the wheel now cut off. Some kind of a nut was loose or detached or almost ready to fall off and fell off. And I have, from the Freedom of Information Act, they at least printed the letter, a copy of the letter of the death threat I got from Sandra Good. That was in 1975 when I was comparing the roots of the SLA to the Manson family and the origins of their being formed by the intelligence, the Pentagon, and the COINTEL programs. Sandra Good was telephoning me and writing me letters and threatening me with being killed by the Manson family. I've had planes where cancellations took place that malfunctioned. One out of Sacramento that would have held up a trip to New York. I had to go the next day, and another one in Chicago O'Hare Airport where we were ready to board, and a TWA was malfunctioning. And we had to wait, and they took the luggage off and brought new meals in and changed planes. And general commotion. And when we went to where we were supposed to be to line up for the next plane, they had another plane listed, and we were running all over the airport in general confusion. I've had the home burglarized, correspondence with Clarence Kelly removed, and film clips from the Howard Hughes mystery were destroyed. I went down to Los Angeles to make scenes, the opening and closing scenes of that movie, and then they were physically destroyed, taken to the lab and physically destroyed. And Emmanuel Zacina, the producer, decided to remake those scenes, and this time I did it with an actor who's on the Love Boat. I forget his name. We did the scenes again, and then once again he had trouble, and now I understand that he's ready to get back and do it again, and he's determined to get the movie out. And other things have happened with people around me. I'll go into those also that are treacherous. The most treacherous of associates working with me it was Don Steiny. We were working on the story of Don Bowles and the link of the information the reporter was trying to find out with what really happened, which was the Howard Hughes connections to the mining swindle in Arizona and the stock market, the fraudulent stock market manipulation that was taking place at the time, and trying to link the Bowles not only to Emprise. When he died, he said Emprise, but it wasn't organized crime that killed him, but it was his link to the Hughes organization. And we were working on that when Don Steiny was telling people about that, and then he was in a car and was driving with two people, one whose son is in the FBI, his father's in the FBI, not the son, another with a so-called friend from Santa Barbara. There was a big car crash. It involved a police chase. They hit a police car. The driver, so-called non-interested or involved person, according to Don Steiny, the son of the FBI man, had been drinking. This fellow never went to jail or had any problems for bumping into a police car which had a blockade or drunk driving or the accident that took place, but Don was thrown out of the car, and he had 3 brain surgeries and almost died. He was in intensive care and in serious condition. The fellow from Santa Barbara that was in the car left that same day and went on down to Santa Barbara and didn't even ask how Don was, and he just was in terrible shape. He was left legally blind. He's back at UC Santa Cruz doing very well as a student, although he really can't see. He had a high IQ, and of course the article stopped and the work on the Howard Hughes book at that point stopped. We were co-authoring a book on Howard Hughes, and we just put it on the shelf and couldn't do any more. That was put away. Not that I won't get back to the Hughes book, but that's what happened to Don. And then, of course, I'm talking about the things that happened to me. We'll talk about the accident that took place in December 1970 when Bonnie was killed, my daughter and her dancing teacher and her best friend. And also there were 6 others in the car that were hurt, and one of them was my other daughter, Barbara, who was almost killed and had a broken back and a broken leg that had traction and pins in it. Her left leg was completely shattered. The kneecap had to be re-broken and set the next year, and her right leg was broken in about 20 places, and she had a broken arm and a cast and a cut from her temple on down her face, her forehead, and a broken nose. And she was at community hospital, first taken to Fort Ord Hospital and then community hospital, and she's in fine condition now, except for a man that I think that is an agent. I've talked about him, and I'll do a little more about that if we have time. But that was the worst thing that happened, and the acid for Marvin was the next worst thing that's happened in my family, and the near plane crashes were bad. The car fires were terrible. The scares the last few weeks, the snake in Canada was bad. The tires coming off is terrible. There is an accumulation of things that has happened to me, and some of them we'll do a little more detail on. The FBI has not sent me the full story of the surveillance that took place. They've sent me just about 20 pages, and goodness knows I have a list of the political things that I've been doing since 1963-64, and I know they have more on me than that, particularly since they had orders to follow all people who are questioning the Warren Commission, and they only sent me a few pages. But in 1966 is the first indication that I was under surveillance, and that is an FBI report that I sent a letter to the editor for the Monterey Herald defending Mark Lane's book, Rush to Judgment. I tell people write letters to the editor, but I have to tell you that if you do write letters to the editor, and I'm sure even if you call talk shows, they have us all down in their computer. September 18th, 1967, when I came home from New Orleans, and I have this on another tape going back to my Freedom of Information Acts, but I just want to repeat this one sentence. The FBI said, due to the fact that Mrs. Brussell has been in contact with Jim Garrison in New Orleans and made public comments concerning the assassination investigations, the FBI and the Secret Service should immediately begin a file on her. They said due to her thinking that she expressed publicly that the United States is becoming fascist and that she pictures America as controlled by conspirators in the government, and she has stated that publicly, they repeated that, stated it publicly, we are to incorporate memorandum suitable for dissemination to the FBI and Secret Service, I suppose all over the country. Well, as I say, that was in 1966 that the surveillance began, at least the report that they're giving me. I look back now, and I believe that in 1964, when I wrote to the government printing office for a set of the hearings on the assassination of John Kennedy, the hearings before the commission, that must have been when the surveillance began, because there are only 8,000 copies of those printed, and they stopped at 8,000. And recently somebody told me at the university in Utah, when he wanted to read one of the volumes, he had to leave his Social Security number to check out, read it there, and read the volumes on the assassination of John Kennedy. But having libraries and personal people reading it, it certainly isn't hard to see which of the 8,000 people are doing their work. Shirley Martin is another woman that started investigating the assassination of John Kennedy very early, and I think she got some articles out and was among the first researchers, along with 11 or 12 others like myself. And then her daughter was killed in an automobile accident in Oklahoma, and Shirley Martin never was active as a researcher again. She stopped right there, and that was the end of her work as far as I understand. I have never heard much about her since, or know people that have been working with her, and haven't read anything she's written. And at the time they said that her daughter had been killed in an automobile crash. So I believe just ordering the commission hearings in 1964 would have been reason for surveillance. And now that we look back over the 30 years of FBI, and since 47, the CIA formation of keeping track of people in the Pentagon, keeping millions of names during the whole anti-war period, if not before, we know that they have more information, but they're not releasing it. In 1967, before I went to New Orleans to see Jim Garrison, I was at Kezar Stadium in San Francisco, and there was a large anti-war demonstration, and there were 21 booths or tables, and I went up purposely early, or a day early, and went to these different booths, and there was Mr. Arnani, who had a magazine called The Majority of One. He had been a victim of a Nazi concentration camp. There was the Youth Against Fascism, the Black Panthers, and I had a big poster which said, "Next March to the National Archives." They had all this energy around Kezar Stadium, and the sign said, "Find out who killed JFK," because I believed that the war escalated right after the death of Kennedy, and if you wanted to stop the war in Vietnam, solve the assassination story, and you'd find out who's escalating the war in Southeast Asia. Well, of course, nobody took me seriously. Nobody at those tables thought that this was important. Arnani had written some articles on John Kennedy, marvelous things, and he is a great, great person. I don't want to put him down. but nobody felt that this was a good suggestion to march to the National Archives and call attention to the fact of the murder of a president. I don't know now if it might have staved off the killing of Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy, if history would have been changed if people had considered the fact of being visual. But I had signs and was visual in those days, and I have a picture of the placard I was signing about wanting the same energy there to go into finding out who was doing the killings. But then after that period in 1967, I went to see Jim Garrison in New Orleans, and as I said, I stayed at the hotel in the French Quarter. My lock was removed from the hotel door. My notebooks were kept. There was this bomb scare when we went to Dallas. We were supposed to change planes, and when I got as far as Dallas, we were told to take off our seat belts. They got a call there was a bomb on the plane. And at that time, I was taken by the Dallas policemen into a separate room other than all the other passengers. And they were allowed to board first, and then agents stood there and saw the papers and notebooks I had brought for Jim Garrison and kept them in Dallas, kept them 5 days, and returned them 5 days later on a special plane back to Monterey, all the material that I brought to Jim Garrison. I'll do more about this now on the other side 2 of the tape. This is side 2 of tape number 360. It's October the 27th, 1978. While I was in New Orleans, I had several people at my home, several friends. One, his name is Jean Durkis, and she worked with the Diggers up in San Francisco at the time of the Haight-Ashbury movement. And Jean was the first person to tip me off about the hippies being killed with poison and acid and being driven crazy, that these chemicals were brought in to drug them and purposely to break up the movement. And also there was another friend at the house who lives in Los Angeles by the name of Vic Spiegel. And then Marvin was at the home, my son Marvin Goodwin, who was going to the University of California in Santa Cruz. He was 19 at the time, and he was writing songs for Bobby Darin. Bobby had given him a base pay of $150 a week just to have the first right to any songs that he'd want, because Marvin had started writing songs, and Bobby thought he had the most talent of any person he had seen around, and he liked Marvin, so he just put him on a retainer fee and was going to produce these songs. And at the house were Carolyn and Pete Gilman. Gilman had been a newspaper man, a writer. He wrote the book Diamond Head. He was at Vietnam during the war. He was with the admirals over in Honolulu. He'd been at parties with Jackie Kennedy at the time. Peter had a home down at the Highlands. He has property all over Carmel. Our piano tuner rents a house that Peter Gilman owns in Carmel. And he always says to me, I know you think Pete's a spy, but he's not. He says just because he picks up the phone and talks to Aristotle Onassis, it's just somewhat of a personal call. He lets out that little story, you know, about Pete's links to Onassis. And at the time of the assassination attempts and riots in France, he was there when de Gaulle was under fire by the same group, exposed the Permindex team that later killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and in future tapes I'm going to do some more about Permindex. Well, Pete and Carolyn with Marvin, when these other friends were there, and they gave him what was supposed to be acid, and Vic said, wait, what are you giving? And they said, oh, it's just acid, he'll just have a trip. And Vic says, well, I'm not going back to Los Angeles if you do this. And she said, no, we'll take him to Big Sur, he'll be all right. And so Gene went back to San Francisco, Vic went to L.A., and then that began what was a nightmare for 10 years. I mean, a literal nightmare. Marvin went to Santa Cruz, got as far as Santa Cruz. He had his own car and drove it there and called my husband and myself, and he'd gone out of his mind. I came home from New Orleans and was at the house, and Marv was up at college, and it seemed that those 5 or 10 days before I heard from him, he had been totally crazy and gone out of his head and didn't contact me. You know, I didn't know where he was. I thought he was doing fine and getting his classes together. It was a fall semester. They were getting ready to start, and I didn't think anything about it, and he called, and Bill went up to get him, and he couldn't find the key to his car. It was thrown away, and he was practically out of his mind, and he was catatonic, and we brought him home, put him in the bed between us. He was stiff and a simulated heart attack, and my first husband is a pediatrician and always took care of the medical needs of the family, the 2 boys and the 3 girls. And so he said, "We'll get Marvin down here. I can get the best doctors, blah, blah, blah." And I didn't know in 1967 what the CIA was doing, or I didn't know that he had ingested anything until a few weeks later when I talked to Vic and Jean that were at the house. So Marvin was flown down and put into a hospital in Los Angeles, and that began a system, a chain reaction of doctors whose names I won't mention on the tape, but someday I really want to sue. And they began a plan right away to send him to Chestnut Lodge in Maryland, which later, when I began to investigate, it was a CIA hospital, which is named in the book. The story of Judith Beckstein writes about her ordeal of how she was politically active in the Kennedy assassination in Chicago and was given some champagne, and a drug had been inserted through the cork, and she went crazy and was put in the CIA hospital, Chestnut Lodge, and she hinted that Artie Bremer was trained or programmed there, that assassins were trained or programmed there. And I called there, and it was run by admirals. And Dr. Eric Byrne had known Marvin. Marv was in group therapy with him at the time. Eric Byrne wrote the book, Games People Play. And he called down there the doctors, and he said, "No, he's not schizophrenic. He has exactly the symptoms they gave him at the time that are in the Senator Church Committee hearings of the LSD that you administer, and then you call in a doctor, and he diagnoses a paranoid schizophrenic, but it's not. We won't tell them that they ingested this LSD plus these various chemicals that they inserted into it, and I have the names of them, and they've come out since." So Eric Byrne called down and told the doctors that Marvin wasn't anything like that, that he was outgoing. He was the extrovert in the family of all the children, and a lot of talent, and he had things really under control and together. And he'd gone to a private school in Arizona, Verde Valley, where 2 years there. David went 4 years. Not a hint or a diagnosis, of insanity, of malfunction, of schizophrenia, no personality work. Got out of schizophrenia symptoms. He was working as a normal person, studying, graduating, went on to the University of California, was working for Bobby Darin. So this process of putting him first there and then Mount Sinai Hospital, where they locked him up, and luckily he had a dime, and he called me and told me they were shipping him away, and I'm convinced that he would be dead or would have had a lobotomy by now. And he called me. Again, as luck would have it, that one dime did it. Like the unsinkable Molly Brown. Sometimes I think I should just put these things into a book. He had a dime and called and said, "They're shipping me back there." And I got an attorney, Jerry Barron, and we went down to Los Angeles, and the court records said the attorney, who was my husband's brother, said that he didn't know the parent of Marvin Goodwin. He knew the father, but I was a legal guardian. We were divorced, that he didn't know where I was. And he was married to my first cousin, the attorney that was shipping him to Chestnut Lodge, along with, it's Dr. Marmer. I'll tell you his name, Dr. Marmer from Mount Sinai Hospital. Back to this. And I called Marmer. I said, "Have you ever sent any patient there before?" And he didn't have any. I said, "How do you know about Chestnut Lodge? Why are you sending Marvin?" And Eric Byrne knew Marvin before all this came on and could give the exact symptoms if there were hearings today on what happens when you take this poison or the person before. But right after that, Eric Byrne, the writer, was walking along Carmel Beach, and he died of a heart attack. He passed out, and his close friend, who was my attorney, Jerry Barron, in the case, gave the eulogy for Eric Byrne. It was a simple ceremony, and he read the services. And Jerry Barron had gone to Los Angeles to fight the guardian, Mr. Kristovich, down there, who later was removed because he was corrupt and was a thief and was removed from office. Again, the county conservator, that they took Marvin's money and savings and were to ship him to Chestnut Lodge. Jerry Barron was our attorney, and Eric Byrne had seen Marv in group therapy. Marv was going to Santa Cruz, but he had trouble relating to longtime friend associates. He was talented and extroverted, but his close personal friends, he had trouble, and he thought if he went to Eric Byrne, and particularly after the games people play, that if he went into this, he'd understand better, his relationship with other people. And he was working this out with Byrne. And so Byrne died, and Jerry Barron gave the eulogy, and a week later, Jerry Barron died. So that the only two people that could ever stand by me, and I was fighting my husband at the time. He thought Marvin should go to Chestnut Lodge. In fact, that was a big wedge. in our marriage at the time, because Bill thought that let them do whatever they want with him, he's crazy, and I said no, he's been poisoned, and the girls turned against Bill, and there was a lot of conflict over this. And so Byrne was dead and Jerry Barron was dead, and that was the same summer that David had the car accident, having dinner with Lee, who teaches at the DLI, the Defense Language School, the only location that Reinhard Gehlen ever attended. Head of Hitler's intelligence Eastern Division, flew to the Pentagon, flew out here to Monterey to the DLI, where there's a nest of white Russians and Nazi agents, and then flew back to Germany, where he had a villa protecting him from war crimes and so forth. David had the car accident. He was thrown out of the car, and that was after having dinner with Lee. When I came home from New Orleans, I was traumatized. I was dizzy, and a doctor, a friend of ours who's at the University of California, who's also a lawyer, Jim Nielsen, a close friend, said, oh, the reason you're dizzy is they probably gave you some radiation in Dallas. See, the police officers came up to the seat that I was on the airplane when the bomb scare came. They said, will you come here? And they put me in a door, and they guarded the door, and I had to sit on a chair in the back of the room while they went through everybody's luggage and opened their cameras and the praline nuts and so forth. And I kept saying to them, well, why don't you talk clean? The whole city is smeared because of the Kennedy assassination. Why do you cops keep this up? Why are you doing this to me? But anyway, I was dizzy, and the bed was going around. I was really reeling. I don't know whether it was a trauma of being followed, someone at the airport then following us when I came home, or keeping my research that I had done. I was trying to make the connections for Jim Garrison of the Dallas-Fort Worth area to the Clay Shaw connections and the Reinhard Gehlen Nazi connections. I was trying to piece it together for him, and I came home and was reeling. And then I went to the bookstore, the Thunderbird bookstore, which is now a large operation bought out by other people, is owned by Jim and Corinne Smith out in the valley, and my friends and I used to call it the Casbah because we believed that this is where all the spies met. And there was a couple that wanted to meet me and wanted to know about Jim Garrison and wanted to know about what I did in New Orleans. They heard that I'd been to New Orleans and about the arrest of Clay Shaw. And they came on as a book publisher and his wife, Teo Savory Brilliant. He had a bookstore, or maybe still has, in Santa Barbara, and they showed me these peace postcards they did, you know, the round circle with the peace insignia, and it was the anti-war period, and they printed peace insignia. And when Bill Turner was at my house, I had dinner with Bill in New Orleans, and he, as a researcher, came to Carmel Valley. He plays tennis here and comes here. He just finished this new book, The Assassination of Robert Kennedy. And when I mentioned to him about Teo Savory Brilliant and her husband, he got from Jim Garrison for me the list of people whose names were in the address book of Clay Shaw that Jim Garrison had in New Orleans. And it seemed that they shared an apartment with Clay Shaw in Mexico, and they were very close to Clay Shaw, and they came on as just people visiting Carmel and printing peace insignias with just a curiosity. Also, I was invited to the Highlands and to have lunch with a group of people who wanted to talk about New Orleans and the Kennedy assassination, what was going on back there in New Orleans. And by that time, Jim Nielsen, the attorney living here, was helping me, and he said, don't go anywhere without a camera and take pictures of people if they're behind you or with you, or if they appear at two or more places. And I went up and had lunch, and I have the names of the people, interesting cast of characters that were there. And then they were going to sit in this veranda room and talk about New Orleans and Clay Shaw. And I took out my camera and I said, well, before I talk about these things, and I've had lunch with people, I always have to photograph them on the advice of my lawyer to know who I'm sharing this information with. So I went around the room and photographed them one by one and said, thank you very much for the nice luncheon. And I left. Now, that was on advice from my lawyer, and I did that, and I still have their names and pictures. In about 1966, 67, just before I went to New Orleans, I was writing a play called Tiger by the Tail about Jack Ruby. Now, it was earlier than that. I have to look up the date. It must have been around 65. And we moved up, it was just when we moved up to the Carmel area, and we left West Los Angeles and moved up here, and there was a house across the street a dentist lived in. He had just bought it, and he had a small child. There were swings and slides, and I was glad because my 4 children were in school, but Diane was just 3 years old, and I was glad there were children in the neighborhood. Well, within 1 or 2 days after we moved in, the slides and swings came out. The house was sold. The family, the dentist, moved out, a wife and family, and in came a man that I later accused of being military intelligence. His name is Mr. Campisi, and he bought the house on the corner. We lived on a cul-de-sac where you can't pass it without somebody seeing where you go, whether you go left or right or however you travel. From his point of view, his house faces both the street that I was on and the highway, Carmel Valley Road. And the neighbors began to call him the Sentinel because he was there night and day. And there was an interesting article about him recently in the Monterey Herald, a long article about his being in the military. And he has a big flagpole that he hangs up. And I always felt, all the time that I lived at that house, I moved from there about 4 years ago, that he was the Sentinel on the road and still is. And he sits in there in the garden and waves. I saw him at a party recently, and he said, "Why don't you wave to me every time you pass?" But usually, I always make a point of giving a great big wave to Campisi. My best friend was parked in the village yesterday and was next to a truck that had Fort Ord on it, and out came Campisi and is driving that car. He didn't come on as retired military. I went to his house once to talk to him about it because I did have my feelings that he was a plant from the military right out at that particular cross-section. And when I went to talk to him about it, I was sitting in the living room, and he had a guest come in who didn't know who I was, and assuming, I guess, that we're all the same ilk. And the person that came in was a black guy who'd been down to Limekiln Creek at Big Sur and had lived with the hippies in some tents and teepees for about 2 weeks and shared their grass and food. And he had a beard, and he was going back to Fort Ord to clean up and shave and go to the proper authorities, and then they were going to do a bust of them and arrest them and round them all up. They had befriended him, and he was talking about getting ready for the bust, but he had stopped at Campisi's to get some questions about his dog, because Campisi keeps these killer dogs, these police dogs, and trains them and sells them out for the police departments, and this guy had one of these dogs and was just checking on his puppy and talking about his counterintelligence work with Campisi while I was there. And then when I came, take a breath here, when I came home from New Orleans in 1967, the plane incident, the bomb scare on the plane, took place in September, and then down about 4 houses from Campisi, facing Carmel Valley Road, was a home owned by a man from military intelligence, and he went overseas. He'd been in Korea and Asia, and he all of a sudden rented a house, and my friend Louise James, who lived right next door, she rented from him a small bungalow, was really surprised that the way they moved out, because she knew them and had a working, talking relationship with these people, rented from them, and they didn't say they were going overseas and didn't say they were moving, and she had no indication. And just all of a sudden they were up and out, and a new family moved in. And this family had a military truck Louise saw move their things in, which isn't unusual because the family was owned by a military family. And on the peninsula, they do rent houses to the people going to Fort Ord or Navy postgraduate school and so forth. But out of this van came this hippie man and a hippie wife and their 4 hippie kids. The 5th came later. In fact, we were so close, I drove them to the hospital when they had their last baby, Carlotta. I got to know them quite well, and Diane was friendly with their daughter, Michelle. We always called her Spy Baby. But this family moved in right next to Louise James, and their name was Winan, Carolyn and Charles Winan. And Charles Winan is the man who is suing Paul Krasner now in Rolling Stone, so I'll do more on him later. But he is the man that moved in next door to my friend Louise James, and so we felt always that this was a counterintelligence group. And then Winan began to publish, just before the Manson murder in 1969, he did the drawings for a book called Children of Change, and the publisher was Kaiser, Henry Kaiser from San Francisco area, and it was a put down on hippies and their violence and their lack of sense of humor. At a time when the hippies had indicated no violence, the violence was coming from the Hells Angels on the outside, and probably the hippies were the greatest bunch with their sense of humor that had come along. And the testament to that is my collection of buttons, which I have saved over the years, starting about that period, and I have several thousand buttons, a great button collection. And it all started with the sense of humor of the hippies, and Winan was doing the illustrations for Kaiser, who later was identified with the CIA LSD drug program coming into Tulane University as well as other places. And they again were recipients of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute money, a whole can of worms. But this particular man and his family, disguised as hippies, were now down the street from us with children going to the same school. And I got to know them because I wanted to know them, but they were surrounding us. In May 1970, the World Affairs Council had a meeting here on the Monterey Peninsula, and it was the time of the Cambodia bombings and Kent State killing of the students, and Spiro Agnew was scheduled to speak. And I went to the GI Coffee House with my friend Louise James, the one that lived next door to Winans, who was later given some kind of drug where her memory and her mind are completely gone. We went to this meeting, and I wanted to make placards about Spiro Agnew saying, tell about your Greek connections. Spiro is a CIA agent. Spiro is linked to Tom Pappas of the CIA. And this was in 1970, and you have to appreciate that the Lewis Tackwood allegations of the Squad 19 that they were getting ready to kill Nixon and make Agnew president. I wanted the people to demonstrate on the area against the war and against Agnew's being there by linking him to the Greek military junta, the fascism that had been put into power by the CIA in 1967, and then the links of the Greek military junta to the new vice president in 1968, Spiro Agnew, and the escalation of the war. Well, the reason I'm talking about the World Affairs Council incident is that I got new information on it, and now I'm almost convinced that this probably or possibly was one of the reasons for the accident that took place in December of 1970 to Bonnie and Barbara and the others, because the hippies and the protesters in the Bay Area, in the Monterey Peninsula rather, there were quite a few of them, and they surrounded the conference grounds at Asilomar where the World Affairs Council was meeting, and they climbed the roofs and they were carrying on, and they didn't want any demonstrations there. This was a pretty peaceful peninsula. And so a gentleman who arranged the World Affairs Council meeting, at Sterling Cottrell, who had been in charge of counterintelligence in Southeast Asia and worked for the State Department, told these people, if you have a spokesman come who speaks to us, who represents you, get off our roofs, get off the beach, leave us. We'll let that spokesman speak for about 10 minutes to represent the street people. So Sterling Cottrell had said that, and so the people said, we want Mae Brussell. And they agreed if they would scram on Friday, I could come on Saturday. And I was located on Saturday, and I went out to Asilomar. Jerry Brown was out there this week. He calls that the poor man's Camp David. Everyone in the world except the president can have conferences at Asilomar. So I went out there Saturday night, and they said, no, I couldn't speak. And there was then a lot of problems because the promise had been made to the street people I could. So they decided to have a meeting Sunday morning early from 8 to 9 before the breakfast on whether or not I could speak. And they had a meeting of the board of directors of the World Affairs Council, which you must appreciate was set up by Mr. McCone, John McCone, who then became director of the CIA later. He was CIA director at the time that Kennedy was president, after Allen Dulles was fired. And they said, no, I couldn't speak. And when I came Sunday morning, the board of directors of the World Affairs Council said I couldn't. And yet I didn't leave the conference grounds, and there were policemen around me, about 8 of them, and 8 guarding the door that I wouldn't come in. And it's not my style to storm in anyway where I'm not wanted. I had been invited there. So a gentleman from Philadelphia, Sherman Chickering, a newspaper man, said, hang around. He sent a message, don't come in, but hang around outside the door. So I just read a book, which I brought, and Sherman Chickering was on the program, and I didn't know at all who he was at the time. He was just a man that said, stay. And he got up on the rostrum, and he told the people there, there were 300 or 400 in the hall, I'm supposed to speak in this time slot allotted from 10 to 11. I have the program in my files put away of various things that have happened to me and about me. And the time slot was allocated. He said, we made a promise to these people Friday night. The board has broken it, but by a show of hands, you can overturn the board. And they had a show of hands, and they allowed me to come in and speak. And they came outside and said, you can come in and speak. Well, I didn't know until 2 weeks ago when I was talking to Sterling Cottrell on the phone that Standard Oil, the vice president of Standard Oil, attending the World Affairs Councils, was the gentleman who said, if you let Mae Brussell speak for 10 minutes, we'll withdraw all money from the World Affairs Council, that you won't have your meetings. It won't happen, and if this happens, these Exxon Standard Oil people said, if she talks 10 minutes, we pull out of the World Affairs Council, which is like saying they won't run it anymore. It would have collapsed. Their little clubby would have collapsed. The only reason Sterling Cantrell told me that was I called him 2 weeks ago because he's trying to fight the takeover. 20th Century Fox has bought Pebble Beach property, and of course the beautiful Monterey Peninsula will become like Miami and New Jersey. The next step will be legalized gambling like Reno, I suppose, and Nevada, the gang from 20th Century Fox, are signing a deal to buy up the whole Pebble Beach property, and Sterling wanted to stop it, and I offered to help, and he said he thought it was funny that I was helping him because of his role in counterintelligence in Southeast Asia and with the State Department, which has nothing to do with preserving the peninsula. If he wants to preserve the peninsula, that's great with me, and keep it the way we want it, and for the reasons many people are living here. Instead of being a residence now, it has become an investment. And, of course, that happened to me in my family in Beverly Hills, the same thing, and now it's happening up here. But the importance of Standard Oil, it comes to my mind when he told me that. I flashed because that was in May 1970. And then in July, I took a trip to Texas to see Penn Jones in Texas. And I took my daughter Bonnie, the one that was killed in the car crash a few months later, and a friend Joey, and my daughter Diane. Barbara was going to Tahiti for a vacation, and the boys were busy. Marvin was still getting over his acid trip and couldn't travel at all, and David was in college, and I decided that I would just take these, Joey and Bonnie and Diane, and I had never seen Penn Jones. He'd been to the West Coast, and he said, hey, why don't you come? And I wanted to see Marguerite Oswald. I went to her home and met her. And we took this trip. Penn thought that one reason for the accident could have happened was my visit to Texas. But now that I think the power of Standard Oil and Exxon and Bruce Roberts in the Gemstone Files, he gave me the Gemstone Files, 350 pages, in August of 72 after the Watergate arrest because I had broken that story on why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped. And in there he named Carlos Marcello and several persons from New Orleans who had set up the car accident that took place just outside of Fort Ord, where the fatal accident where Bonnie was killed. And I even put away what Bruce Roberts gave me in 72 and didn't want to read too much of that and didn't want to dwell on it until my head was really better ready to deal with that material. When we got to the hotel room in Texas, we checked into a motel, and it was in Arlington, Texas, between Fort Worth and Dallas. I called Penn and I called Marguerite Oswald, and of course when I saw Marguerite the next day and went to her home, she said, you never call from, I don't know where you call from, gas stations or payphones or whatever, because after we called her and went out to dinner and we went back to our hotel room, there was a man outside the door with a big bullwhip, and he stood by our car and he cracked that bullwhip all night and through the early evening. And when we went to our car, the girls were hot and they wanted to get bathing suits or something, or you know, you travel to a motel and you pull up and your car's filled with garbage to empty. He stood by us and used that bullwhip and cracked it, and it was terrifying. And I didn't know, again, whether something would happen at night. And sure enough, he had the room next to us with the connecting doors, and I couldn't lock my side. It was like New Orleans where the door lock was off after the first night. And I guess it's just dumb luck. I don't know. We stayed there that night. We went to a different place the next day. We checked out, and I never followed up and never asked who he was and never took the license plate. I think I went through all of these years mostly like in a state of shock. So many things were coming down, and I was dumber then. Now if there's a car parked on my property in Canada, I can say to you, hey, this guy's parked there, and here's the car number, and give you the license number. But I wasn't very smart in those days, and I never even dreamt that all of this was going to come down to me. Or even after that plane incident in New Orleans when I was taken off the plane in Dallas. In December in 1970, 3 people in the front seat of a Volkswagen van were driving in that front seat, and I'm sure that nobody could hit or guess which one of my children would be there or even be in the front seat, because actually there were 6 in back, and both of my girls could have been passengers and just injured. But Sharon Elliott, a teacher, she was a dance teacher, she was only 23 years old, and Bonnie Brussell, 14, and Cecilia Neal, whose father was in the State Department also, 16 years old, were sitting in the front seat of a Volkswagen van which just went out of control. They were coming home from a dance class up at Cabrillo College, and hit the back of a car driven by John Anthony Zavone, who was 41 at the time, from Watsonville. And there was a Steve Garcia from Fort Ord who received, in quotes, minor injuries. 3 people were killed, and 6 were seriously injured. No, 7. Zavone was seriously injured, had his back broken, and was permanently paralyzed. The only person that walked away from the scene and then left the area and went AWOL from Fort Ord and then went to Utah was a man named Steve Garcia. And this program isn't about the details of the accident that took place, except to tell you that that would make a story in itself. And someday when, again, I get my head straight, I will compile all of this and make a lawsuit against the federal government, if I live through it, to do it. That's one of the good things about the Winan trial in San Francisco, is that the trial transcript is we're going to bring out many of the things that did happen to me and why I was watching Charles Winan and what's happened to our family, and it will be court record and entered in the court, and I don't know if this is happening in any other court case so far in the country. At least I'm not aware of it. I know the drugging of Dr. Olson by the CIA with the acid they gave him was settled out of court, and many of these cases are settled out of court and they're not allowed to go to court. If I get a good, strong lawyer, I will take them to court. But that was in December of 1970. Oh, just prior to the accident, when Bonnie was killed and Barbara was so badly injured and almost killed, in the summer of 70, after the trip to Texas, in the September, I took a quick trip with a friend up to Canada. He had to get some papers that were there, some passport papers and documents he needed. He was going to move to Sweden, and he needed these papers, and I said that I'd go up with him. And we went to Vancouver, and he told me not to leave the hotel room and stay there. People do have ways of entering hotel rooms, and he felt a little paranoid about this. I made the mistake of going out for breakfast. I never do obey. While he was out getting his papers, and there was somebody shuffling up papers and was in our hotel room and ran out. And at the motel where we stayed, the man told me they didn't have a maid doing the service there. She wasn't even dressed as a maid. But leaving Vancouver and going back to Grants Pass, coming back to the Carmel area just about 6 weeks before the accident in the fall, September of 1970, that's when our car went up in flames outside of Grants Pass, and we were almost blown up. The explanation had something to do with a shoe pin that was removed. I don't know the mechanics of a car. I might just continue on this saga from 1970 to 1978 to update you. I was going to do the Pope next week, but there's so many more things, and maybe it's good for you to have a record in case something does happen to me. It will be a record of things that took place during this time.